In this lecture, we're going to take a look at the social consciousness of the very earliest Christians in a period that's frequently referred to as the Patristic Period, a period from the death of Christ to the time when Constantine made Christianity one of the official religions of the Roman Empire. That was in 325 BCE. It's a period of episodic persecution. Sometimes people say it's the age of martyrs, and of course there's some truth to this, but sometimes it's overdrawn that all the time Christians were being persecuted everywhere in the Roman Empire, and it was constant and a persistent persecution. That's not true. The persecutions tended to be episodic, and they also tended to be localized, in the sense that they weren't everywhere in the Roman Empire. They were focused usually on in a certain area. Frequently it was very focused in Rome, but in the outlying areas there was very little or much less persecution going on. So the idea of Christians being fed to the lions, as true as it wasn't just happening everywhere, and it happened episodically and in very specific locations. Nevertheless, Christianity is very much a fringe sub rosa movement. By sub rosa, I mean it's a secretive organization. It's really not an institution. We tend to think of Christianity as from the very beginning very institutional, and has these huge edifices and churches, and that's just not true. The first 300 years of the church's existence, it was very much an underground movement, hiding from not just persecution, but also just from the biases of their fellow Romans. There were strong biases against Christians. And so getting a job, getting in the army, having a career was difficult for Christians, just as it is for any oppressed minority. So they were sub rosa for a lot of different reasons. This period is characterized by intense theological and philosophical debate and development. And that's why the social consciousness of the patristics, or that's one of the reasons it's so important, because this is a time when many of the very basic issues and basic doctrines of the church become settled, become debated and figured out, so to say. And those, you might call them bad ideas, are kind of filtered out, and Christianity becomes a more established theology and philosophy. In the earliest church, there really is no official doctrine. There's no canon law. There are no standards governing liturgy, morality, or other practices. So these debates are wide open debates, and in many ways the person of Jesus gets cast in so many ways, and in ways that today we would consider absurd, crazy kinds of ways. All of these things are being debated at this time, and the bad ideas, like I said, are being filtered out over the course of these decades and centuries of debate. Now, throughout these 300 years, we have many sources of great thinkers, great philosophers, seminal theologians, and I'm just going to list a number here. The Didache, I'm not going to describe all of them, but the Didache, the Shepherd of Hermas, are anonymous works. We don't know who wrote them, but these are very influential theological documents. There's the Epistle of Diognetus, Clement of Alexandria, Origen, Basil of Caesarea, St. Augustine, Cyprian of Carthage, Ambrose of Milan, John Chrysostom, Gregory of Nyssa, Tertullian, and others. So there are literally dozens and dozens of patristics. They don't necessarily agree with one another. As I said, it's a time of debate, a time of, there's a way in which this is the time when the church does a brainstorming. Who is Jesus? Well, let's think this one through, and let's throw ideas out on the table and see, which ones float, which ones don't. In fact, some of them argue forcefully with their contemporaries about Christian beliefs and practices, of course, during this time of debate. Nevertheless, there are many areas of agreement, especially around the issues of social justice. And so we're going to take a look at 6 or 7 principles that come out of this period of social consciousness and social justice. So the unique contribution of the patristics to Catholic social theory are the following. First of all, this idea of the transformation of values. It was expected that when a person became Christian, things would change for them. And even if they were wealthy people who were very successful business people of their day, there was an expectation that their lives of avarice and greed, if they had been living a life of avarice and greed, would be transformed when they became Christian, and that their values would transform, and that they would go from being avaricious to being generous. And so the conversion to Christianity was this idea that it came with it, this idea of conversion of our values. Our values would be transformed by this acceptance of Christ. There was this belief that we would be converted from our attachment to things when we became Christian, that we would no longer be wrapped up in material possessions, but we would be much more committed to one another as human beings, and to Christ and to God. There's this belief that we as Christians, if we are Christian, believed in this universal destination of the material world, which we've talked about in earlier lectures on the biblical roots of Catholic social thought. It's the idea that all things were made by God, and therefore all things were meant as a common heritage for all of us, and that individuals and groups were not supposed to usurp things for themselves to the detriment of others. Fourthly, the patristics ultimately identify Christ with the poor, so that when you encounter a poor person or an outcast or a widow or someone else, you are really encountering Christ himself, not just some romantic ideal, but actually you are encountering Christ on the street when you are encountering the poor. This is another unique contribution that the patristics bring to this theology that they are developing. The idea of sharing one's possessions, if you were wealthy in any way, or even if you were just you had some degree of wealth, when you joined the Christian community, it was often the expectation that all of your wealth became the possession of the Christian community, that your wealth would be shared especially with the poor and the outcasts, but also just with everyone, and that your possessions were no longer yours but belonged to everyone. And of course this brings up the idea of Christians being drawn together in these close-knit communities of mutual support. And of course there were many reasons, not just theological and philosophical, but even sociological reasons why Christians felt the need to gather into these communities of mutual support. And of course we talked about how persecution and other things brought Christians together and made them realize that they needed one another. They needed the support of one another to survive in a world that in many ways was opposed to their very existence. The social teachings of the patristics provides certain elements that continue to shape the social teachings of the church today, and you'll hear echoes of these 6 points that I just outlined above in the encyclicals that you're reading for this class.